They're Tearing Down Tim Riley's Bar by Rod Serling. Read by Scott MacDonald. At precisely 3 o'clock, Harvey Doane erupted from his office, his intense, hairless college boy face crowned by the mop of Edwardian hair. He looked briefly down the long row of secretaries at their desks and listened briefly to the collective sounds of 40 typewriters mixed with the monotonous voices of the 2 switchboard operators at the far end of the corridor who plugged in and plugged out and repeated over and over again Pritikin's plastic products. On Harvey Doane's door, the gold lettering identified him as Assistant Sales Director. And in Harvey Doane's personal view, neither the title nor the function fitted his consummate talents. He saw Mr. Pritikin come out of his office and pause by his secretary's desk. He noted, satisfied, the open door to Randy Lane's office next door. The room was empty, and Jane Alcott, Lane's secretary, looked nervously from Pritikin to the clock and then over toward Doane. Alcott was one of the few broads on the floor who had a fix on Doane, and read him for the aggressive, climbing, and altogether merciless young bastard that he was. Doane sauntered over to her, looked up toward the clock, checked briefly that Pritikin was still there, and then said in an overloud voice, "Randy not back yet?" Jane Alcott bit her lower lip, looked nervously toward Pritikin, and tried to keep the naked dislike she felt for Doane out of her voice. "He had several meetings outside." Doane took another quick, surreptitious look toward Pritikin to make certain he was listening. "With several outside martinis?" he said, chuckling and wiggling a finger toward the open door to Lane's empty office. He gave Miss Alcott an extravagant wink, then lowered his eyes in humble embarrassment as Mr. Pritikin approached. Beautiful, he thought, as he forced himself to look surprised that Pritikin had overheard or that Pritikin was even there. 3 o'clock. Lane still out, established the drinking, and let Pritikin see him there, functioning, while his superior tippled away the afternoon. Beautiful. Mr. Pritikin had a heavy semi-frog face with drooping, thick-lidded eyes, and when angry or impatient, he talked through semi-clenched teeth. "When is Mr. Lane due back?" he asked Miss Alcott. "I have to talk to him about the car stair order." "I'm right on top of that myself, Mr. Pritikin," Doane offered, much too quickly. "I can give you any information you need, sir." Pritikin looked at him briefly. "I thought Lane was handling that." Miss Alcott had her mouth open to speak, but Harvey Doane had already rolled his artillery through the breach. "I've pretty much taken that over," Doane said. "Got a full report on my desk. If you'll just give me a minute, sir, I'll get it." He turned quickly and trotted back to his office. Jane Alcott felt her cheeks burn. She sensed Pritikin staring at her. Her hands shook, and she tried to use them to rearrange her desk. A flower pot, 6 inches to the left, pencils straightened out into a line, typing paper smoothed out, and then her hands just lay there with nothing further to do. "Where is he, Miss Alcott?" Pritikin asked in a softer tone. He mentioned some meetings outside, Mr. Pritikin." "I've no doubt," Pritikin said. "Most of his business of late seems to be outside." He turned away, then looked at her over his shoulder. "Tell him I want to see him when he gets back." He started back toward his own office as Doane came dog-trotting out, a sheaf of papers in his hand, looking like a cross between a cocker spaniel and a vulture. "Mr. Pritikin, I have the car stair material right here, sir." Pritikin paused by his office door. "Bring it in here," he said. And Harvey Doane, anchor man on the Olympic back-knifing squad, headed toward him and into his office. "Mr. Pritikin," Miss Alcott called. Pritikin turned back toward her from his office door. "Yes, Miss Alcott." Miss Alcott knew she was blushing and could do nothing about it. "Today is Mr. Lane's 25th anniversary," she said, trying to keep her voice even. Pritikin frowned at her. "His anniversary? That man's been a widower for 25 years with the company," Miss Alcott tried to say without emotion. "I wasn't aware of that," Pritikin said. Again, he turned to enter his office, and again her voice stopped him. "I only broached it, sir," she said, because maybe someone in the firm took him to lunch or something. Just a little celebration?" Pritikin's nod conveyed nothing. He simply moved into his office, where the eager Doane stood in the middle of the room, and closed the door. Miss Alcott waited for a moment, then rose and entered Randolph Lane's office. She moved hurriedly over to his phone, dialed an outside line, waited for a moment. "Antoine," she asked, "is Mr. Lane there? Did he have lunch there? But he's not there now? Well, if he should come in, will you tell him to please get in touch with his office right away?" "Yes, thank you. This is his secretary." She cradled the phone for a moment, then let her eyes wander over Lane's desk. There was a picture of his wife, very young, a doodled calendar with the day's date circled and starred, a scribbled notation on it which read, "quarter of a century." And as her eyes quickly inventoried the desk, she saw the whiskey bottle protruding from an open side drawer. She closed the drawer quickly, tidied up the desk, then glanced toward the door to see Randolph Lane standing there. He looked as he always looked after a wet lunch, tie at half-mast, normally rumpled shirt collar even more rumpled, thinning hair hanging over his eyes, much too tight suit, buttoned in front with difficulty. And the eyes, the tired eyes, grave but good-humored. He bowed as he closed the door behind him. "How do you do, madam? Could I interest you in a line of plastics?" Miss Alcott felt like a woman who'd lost her child on the beach and then found him again. First, she wanted to hug him, then belt him. "It's 3:00, she said. Lane brought his wristwatch to within an inch of one eye, focusing with difficulty on the dial. "Why, so it is," he said. "Inexorable time in its flight." He walked across the room, over to his desk. "Well, what the hell," he said. "This is a special day." "I know," Miss Alcott said, softly. Lane looked up at her, squinting. "On this day, Miss Alcott," he announced, 25 years ago, having conquered Europe for General Eisenhower and President Truman, I doffed my khaki and I enlisted in the cause of Pritikin's plastic products. 25 years, Miss Alcott. A quarter of a century." He moved around the desk and sat down, blinking a little. "So what the hell?" he said, grinning. "If a man can't get a little sauced on this kind of an anniversary, where the hell does that leave the flag and motherhood?" He looked briefly around his desk, then across it to Miss Alcott. "Any messages?" he asked. Miss Alcott tried to keep the concern out of her voice. "Mr. Pritikin was looking for the car stair order. Mr. Doane took it into him." She tried not to sound accusative, but the word Doane got spat out. Her dislike of Harvey Doane was no secret. From his carefully curled locks to the bottom of his bell-bottom trousers, he was a conniving little bastard, and both she and Lane knew it. Lane smiled at her, a smile slightly worn around the edges. Mr. Doane took it into him, he repeated. He grinned again and shook his head back and forth. Johnny on the spot Doane. With assistants like him, who needs assassins? He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, arms folded behind his head. Lynn shrugged. What the hell difference? Then he smiled again. You see before you, Miss Alcott, a man much too old and set in his ways, and at the moment a little too deep in his cups to give battle to the young Turk in the cubicle to my immediate left. That young Turk, Miss Alcott thought but did not say, is made up of one half brass and one half elbow, and his mission in life is to ace you right out of the picture. She gnawed on her lip. He's damned anxious for your job, she said. You're aware of that, aren't you? Lane's smile was wistful. He nodded, then turned in the chair to look out the window behind him. You know where I've been the last hour, Miss Alcott? I've been watching them tear down Tim Riley's bar. Again he swiveled around in his chair. That doesn't mean anything to you, does it? Should it? No. It's an ancient, ugly son of a bitch eyesore, he said, which will now be turned into a 20-story bank building with an underground parking lot, and it'll have glass walls and fluorescent lighting and high-speed self-service elevators and piped-in music in the lobby. He leaned forward, elbows now on the desk. And a year from now, he continued, nobody will remember that Tim Riley had a bar on that corner, or that he sold beer for a nickel a glass, or that he had snooker tables in the back, or that he had a big Nickelodeon, and you got 3 Glenn Millers for a dime. He laughed, looked briefly at his late wife's picture, then remained silent for a moment. And while I was standing there, he said, looking up at his secretary, with all the other sidewalk superintendents, the thought occurred to me that there should be some kind of ceremony, maybe a convocation of former beer drinkers and Timothy Riley patrons to hang a wreath or say a few words. He rose, and his smile was vague and wistful. There he stood in the garbage dump of the past 2 decades, looking across the wreckage of 20 lonely years, and he knew, clearly, rationally, achingly, all the martinis on God's earth couldn't bring it back. The objects of a man's love weren't pawned for a future desperate moment. They were buried and could only be mourned. Farewell, Timothy Riley's bar, Lane said softly. Home of the nickel beer, snooker emporium, repository of Bluebird records, 3 for a dime. We honor you and your passing. Farewell. Farewell, Timothy Riley, and terraplanes and rumble seats and saddle shoes and Helen Forrest and the Triple C camps, and Andy Hardy and Lum Abner and the world champion New York Yankees. Rest in peace, you age of innocence, you beautiful, serene, carefree pre-Pearl Harbor long summer night. We'll never see your likes again. He felt the familiar ache, the lonely air pocket inside of him, and he wished at that moment that he hadn't had so much to drink. He finally raised his head, took a deep breath, grinned at her. "There is nothing," he said lightly. "Nothing as remotely embarrassing as a middle-aged crying jag, and I humbly ask your forgiveness for having been exposed to one." Jane Alcott tried to say something. She wanted to tell him that he could deliver up crying jags, four-letter Anglo-Saxon words, and anything else that might please him. All she could do was smile at him, and she hoped, oh God, she hoped he'd understand. "Just bear with me, will you, Miss Alcott?" Lane said, seeing the look on her face. They knocked down the walls of Timothy Riley's bar, and as silly and as goddamned sentimental as it sounds, I lost something. Harvey Doane's voice intruded into the room like a race car slamming into a bleacher full of spectators. "What do you say, sport?" Doane said, entering the room. "Have a good lunch?" Lane and Miss Alcott exchanged a look. She very quickly moved past Doane and out to her desk, closing the door behind her. Lane sat back down in his chair. "The question again? My lunch?" "Dandy." Doane walked across the room and sat on the corner on the desk. He examined his nails. "I took the Carstairs stuff into the old man. He was kind of anxious." "Good of you," Lane said. Doane looked at him ever so briefly. "And I added a few embellishments. Hope you don't mind." Lane shrugged. "Be my guest." Doane was opening the can, and he was 3/4 of the way. Slight change in tone now, just a little incisive. "And the sales pitch you had in the opening, I had to touch that up quite a bit." This time, he looked straight at Lane, waiting for the explosion. "Touch away, lad," Lane said affably. "Touch away." There was silence. "You put me on?" Harvey Doane asked. Lane pointed to himself. "Me? Put you on? Why would I want to do that?" Doane stood up from the desk. "Usually when I try to be a little independent, you step on me." Lane studied him very carefully. "Usually," he said, very softly, "when you try to be a little independent, you're also a little too flamboyant, a little too artsy-craftsy, and a little too dishonest." He leaned across the desk. "I put my foot on you, Mr. Doane, to keep you within 10 feet of Mother Earth. I know you're one hell of a hotshot peddler, but if you don't get mildly restrained along the way, you'll be selling Brighton Beach sand and calling it moon rocks." Doane's smile looked like a puckered-up fist. "Takes a while, doesn't it?" he said. "To do what?" "To get a rise out of you, Ferdinand the Bull." Lane cocked his head, studying the younger man. "My son, the matador." He pointed to Doane. "Young Master Doane, who simply has to draw blood before the 6 o'clock whistle or the day is shot down." Again he pointed to Doane. "Give yourself a point. You pricked me. You got the old bull riled." He stood up and moved out from behind the desk. "I would ask that you keep one thing in mind, Mr. Doane. There is still a pecking order around here. You're still outranked. You're still my assistant." His voice rose as he stood a half an arm's length away, so close to Doane that he could smell his cologne. "And until such a day as you are no longer my assistant, I want you to keep your frigging bloody hungry little hands off my desk, away from my business, and—" The sound of the door opening stopped him abruptly. Both men turned to see Mr. Pritikin standing there. He looked from one to the other. "Is this a private altercation?" he asked, "or may I involve myself?" As he turned to close the door, he saw Miss Alcott at her desk, white-faced and frightened. He very grimly and pointedly closed the door. He turned to face the two men again. "Well, Doane?" Doane turned into a West Point plebe, standing straight, tall, and honorable. "There really wasn't anything, sir." His voice was low, like a man dying bravely and uncomplainingly from a dum-dum bullet wound. "Mr. Lane was simply reminding me of his seniority." "Try that, Randolph," he thought to himself. "Keep the knife in and squirm, or pull it out and bleed to death." "Perhaps Mr. Lane should be reminded," Pritikin said, "that seniority doesn't come from merely putting in time. Not on this ball club." He looked menacingly toward Lane. "I judge a man by his current record, not last season's batting average." Harvey Doane's sigh was almost audible. It was working. The Doane master plan for ultimate advancing was zooming down the track on schedule. Randy Lane simply smiled. There was no bite in his voice, and no defense. "What have you done for me lately?" "Huh?" he said. Pritikin, like Doane, needed opposition. When he took on a man, it had to be nose to nose. Belligerence he could shout down, and weakness he could tear to pieces. But blandness, that was another thing. Pritikin felt the anger rise. "Precisely," he agreed. "And what you've done for us lately isn't very damn much, Lane. You've put in time, but not much else. Protracted lunch hours, considerable martini drinking, and precious damn little mustard cut." He nodded toward Doane. "Candidly, Lane, your assistant here has left you whinnying at the starting gate." Again, Lane grinned and waggled his finger at the heavy-set, red-faced man. "Mr. Pritikin," he said gently, "you're mixing your metaphors. You want this baseball or horse racing?" Pritikin did everything but shake. "I want this understood is what I want. Your performance, Lane, has deteriorated. Your sales have slipped. Your entire attitude has become sloppy." Harvey Doane held his breath. It was coming. It had to be coming. "I suggest a trial period," Pritikin said, "during which both you and Mr. Doane will share the director's spot. He'll no longer be answerable to you. You can consult each other, but any ideas he has of his own he's free to follow. That understood?" Lane nodded. His voice was altogether affable. "Clearly." Doane stood stock still. The humble hero just getting his congressional medal. Pritikin moved to the door, then turned. He knew then, as he had pretty much guessed for the past year or so, that Lane was on his way out. He was sufficiently lousy as a judge of men not to realize that Harvey Doane, on his best day, was a plastic counterpart to the legal ambulance chaser. But though insensitive, he was not a vindictive man, nor a cruel man. He coughed slightly at the door, looked a little indecisive, then blurted out, "Incidentally, Lane, I am reminded that this is your 25th year with the company. This little unpleasantry notwithstanding, I just wanted to know that you have my congratulations." He waited for a response. Lane said nothing. Pritikin opened the door and walked out, closing it behind him. Lane walked over to his desk, opened the drawer, and took out the bottle. Then he looked across at Doane, who stood there looking uncomfortable. Something else, was there? Lane asked. Like maybe a funeral oration? Doane wet his lips. I just wanted to assure you, sport, that I had nothing to do with this. It was just as much a surprise to me as it was to you. Lane nodded. Honest? Believe it, Doane said. Lane nodded again. He just called you in, pinched you on the cheek, and promoted you, and you were shocked out of your skivvies. Is that it? He stared at Doane. Young Mr. Doane, he said very softly, why don't we level with one another? I'm on the way down. You're on the way up. And we're just passing each other in midair. I'm looking at a threat and you're looking at an obstacle. And that's a lousy basis for any friendly mutual back-scratching. It occurred to Doane at this moment that Randy Lane, age 45 plus, and halfway to lushdom, could still be a formidable opponent. He tried to look humble and sound ingratiating. Look, Randy, he said, there's no reason why we can't work together. No reason in the world, Lane replied, except that we don't complement each other. I'm not a competitor, young Mr. Doane. I wear gloves. I observe ancient and archaic amenities. I'm an old-fashioned slob. The fancy knifing I leave to commandos like you. He sat down in his desk chair. Now a favor? Would you please get the hell out of here? Frozen-faced, Doane turned on his heel and walked stiffly out of the office, slamming the door. Lane uncorked the bottle, looked around for a glass, and failing, tilted the bottle to his mouth and swallowed down just enough to make his eyes water. Then he corked up the bottle and put it back into his desk drawer. There was a knock on the door, and Miss Alcott opened it and entered. It was odd, Lane thought, as he looked up at her. She couldn't have been over 25, bright, stacked, and altogether lovely. She'd been with him for a little over a year. How could someone who looked like that grow so fiercely loyal to someone like him? Can I get you something? She asked. Lane had to laugh. Why, indeed. I had in mind a gold watch properly inscribed for this anointed day. Something like, well done, good and faithful serpent. He shook his head. Short of that, my love, I don't think there is anything you can get me. Miss Alcott took another step into the office. You know, she said a little nervously, on an anointed day like this, a guy shouldn't have to spend the evening alone. I've got a steak in the freezer saved for a special occasion. I've got 2 large Idahos suitable for baking, and a great salad dressing I make myself. There was a silence. What do you say? Lane smiled. I say that you're a very dear young lady. I say thank you. No, thank you. Why not? She asked, disappointed. Lane shrugged. The syndrome of the 25-year man who didn't get his gold watch. He's too full of himself and too sorry for himself, and he makes lousy company. Then he smiled. Another time, maybe. Sure, Miss Alcott said. Miss Alcott, Lane called to her as she turned. She looked back at him. You're a hell of a good lady. I mean that. Jane Alcott felt something rise inside of her. It was female and mixed up and impossible to isolate and understand. She'd been feeling it more and more with Randy Lane for the better part of 6 months. It was affection, sympathy, compassion, and something far more physical than she wanted to admit. "I guess," she said, "it's because I work for a hell of a good guy. And I mean that." She turned and left him sitting there. The top 3 floors of the 4-story building had already been knocked down, and only Tim Riley's bar remained standing, faded and ancient brick, broken and boarded windows with a sign hanging askew. Tim Riley's Bar was spelled out in weathered, barely legible printing. Randy Lane sat on a fire hydrant, staring up at the sign, thinking how dejected and forlorn it looked, and how the wood slats covering the big window looked like a giant eye patch. He very carefully got up from the hydrant and took an unsteady walk over to the front door. This, too, was crisscrossed with wooden boards, and there was just about 6 inches of space that he could peer through into the interior. All he could make out was the dark outline of the full-length bar, and nothing else. He heard footsteps on the sidewalk, and turned to see the bulky, blue-coated figure of McDonough, the cop, the genial county Mayo face much more wrinkled than he remembered. "They're closed," McDonough said. Lane nodded, and again peered through the wood slats. "Don't I know it?" The policeman studied Lane, then looked up past the sign to the empty sky where there had once been a building. "I know how you feel," he said gently. "First arrest I ever made was inside Tim Riley's. 2 guys fighting over whether Carl Hubble could throw harder than Lefty Gomez. And if that don't date me, Randy, I'll join Tim Riley under the sod." Lane felt memories of his own welling up. "First date I ever had," he said, "was right here, with my wife. When her father heard about it, he almost had a stroke." McDonough smiled. "Katie," he said softly. "Katie Donovan, as if I didn't remember her. She was a lovely, lovely lady, Randy." He felt the ache again, the air pocket. "That she was," he said. Then he grinned as other recollections took over. "And when I came back from the service, they had a surprise party for me in there. My God, McDonough, you were there. The train was late, remember? By the time I got here, my old man was sound asleep in the corner." McDonough laughed. "And don't I remember that? But I'll say this for him. He could drink a keg of that stuff. And many's the night I sat with him while I did." The 2 men both laughed, and then stared toward the darkened interior. McDonough studied Lane's profile, and couldn't help but notice the seedy look to his clothes and the way his shoulders slumped. "Things going well for you, Randy?" he asked. Lane nodded. "I'm 46 years old. I'm 6 years younger than my father was when he died." McDonough put a hand on his shoulder. "When I first saw you in here, Randy, I had a spring in my step, arches in my feet, and my ambition in life was to capture Al Capone. Then one morning I woke up, and I knew I'd run out of vinegar. All I wanted was Epsom salt. So I just walk a little slower, and I pray for quiet nights, and I just keep reminding myself that I'm flat-footed and slow as molasses, but I'm still a whole hell of a lot faster than Al Capone is." He winked and grinned. "Look after yourself, Randy." He turned, and with his flat-footed policeman gait, continued down the sidewalk, swinging his club in the manner of policemen 50 years before. Randy Lane watched him walk off and disappear around the corner. Then once again, he looked up at the Tim Riley sign. It occurred to him he could go to the next block and the cocktail lounge that stayed open until 4. But a younger crowd usually gathered there. They played rock music on the juke, and it was so damned noisy. But he had no choice except perhaps to go home. Home. The empty apartment. The late show on television. The TV dinner. But what the hell? Tim Riley's wasn't serving that night. So he turned and was about to walk away when he heard it. Faintly, as if from far off, the singing voices of "For He's a Jolly Good Fellow," indistinct, but growing louder. He retraced his steps over to the door and once again peered into the interior of the darkened bar. A car drove by, and briefly its headlights shone over Lane's shoulder to illuminate the inside. Then the car pulled around the corner, taking its light with it, and once again the cobwebbed, musty interior was dark. Or was it? For a while Randy Lane stood there peering through the slats. He suddenly made out the outlines of people. They looked fuzzy, as if seen through gauze, but they were there. People holding up mugs of beer. They looked like slow-motion characters of an ancient film. But there was Tim himself behind the bar, and there was his father in the corner, blinking his eyes. Lane stepped back and sent his foot in a swinging arc to smash against the wooden slats. One of them cracked. Another flew off one of its nails. He yanked at it furiously, pulled it aside, kicked again at the one remaining, and then smashed the full weight of his body against sagging door and entered Tim Riley's bar. Just for a moment, just for a single moment, he saw a banner stretched across the room which read, "Welcome home, Randy." And in that moment, the voices were loud, and the faces recognizable. His father, Tim Riley. Even McDonough was there, a very young cop. And something surged inside Randy Lane. A joy, an excitement, a sense of satisfaction, being where he belonged. But as he turned toward his father, the room went dark and empty. Cobwebs and wires from dismantled fixtures and a cracked mirror were all he could make out in the darkness. He stumbled over a broken, overturned chair as he turned and moved back toward the front door. Before leaving, he turned once again to survey the room. His loneliness had been a dull, formless thing, and he'd learned to carry it with him. But now he felt the sudden, sharp, jabbing pain of something beyond loneliness, some overwhelming anguish almost impossible to bear. He suddenly felt lost and bewildered, as if something important and integral had just eluded him. He walked very slowly out of Tim Riley's bar, hesitated for a moment, then headed for the cocktail lounge down the street on the next block. He'd sit at the bar, trying to ignore the nuzzling kids and the blaring rock and the late-night bimbos who would inventory him, then move away to a richer pasture. A richer-looking guy, and a younger one, and he'd drink just enough to dull the pain and forget the air pocket. And maybe, just maybe, but by the dawn's early light, he could forget Tim Riley's bar and all the love that went with it. Shortly after 9 a.m. the following day, Miss Alcott stood in front of Mr. Blodgett, personnel director of Pritikin's Plastic Products. He was a short, fastidious, fussy little man who seemed always to be behind time and rushing to catch up. He looked up as she arrived at his desk, briefly checked her, then sorted out some papers on his desk. "You have a change in assignment," he announced. Miss Alcott caught her breath. "A change in assignment?" "Correct. We're moving you." "From where to where?" she asked. Blodgett managed to smile. "Relax, Miss Alcott. We're not sending you to a frontier outpost. Just about 8 feet to your left. You'll join Mr. Doane as of next Monday morning." He reshuffled the papers, looked at her briefly, gave her a nod of dismissal, then started to jot down notes on a pad. He tried to ignore the fact that she remained there. He looked up again. Something else. Then he frowned. She looked white-faced, ill. "Are you all right, Miss Alcott?" "Did you say don't?" she asked. Blodgett nodded. "His secretary, Miss Trevor, has turned in her notice. She's getting married, I believe. Anyway, she'll be leaving us, so you'll assume her duties." Why, he thought, did the woman just stand there? She was supposed to be such a good secretary. Didn't she understand this altogether simple and quite irrevocable move? He looked up at her impatiently. "Was there something else, Miss Alcott?" "Mr. Blodgett," Jane Alcott said. "What about Mr. Lane?" Blodgett looked at her blankly. "Mr. Lane?" She nodded. "I've been with him for over a year." Blodgett put the pencil in his mouth. "I'm not sure what the arrangement will be. You'll have a replacement, of course, but for the moment, I'm told that Mr. Doane will need you as of Monday morning, requested you personally, as a matter of fact." "What if I don't want to work for Mr. Doane?" Blodgett blinked, surprised. "And what's that supposed to mean?" "It's supposed to mean that he does everything but wear track shoes. He's got 5 sets of hands, he pinches fannies, and he doesn't happen to be fit to shine Mr. Lane's shoes." Blodgett threw the pencil down on his desk. "Regrettably," he said, "in my capacity as personnel director, I've neither the time nor the inclination to listen to your personal assessments of the executives of this organization. I'll have to put it to you bluntly, Miss Alcott. You'll either report for work with Mr. Doane on Monday morning, or you'll report to the cashier this afternoon to pick up your severance pay. Now, which will it be, please? I'm very busy." She looked at that moment no longer angry and incredibly young. "Does Mr. Lane know?" she half whispered. "I'm sure someone has seen fit to tell him," Blodgett said, again turning to the papers on his desk. And when he looked up moments later, Miss Alcott had left. She got on the elevator and went back to her floor. As she moved down the corridor of desks, she saw a group of giggling girls surrounding Doane's secretary. There were gift wrappings thrown about and oohs and ahs of delight as silver things shone on her desk. One or two of the girls looked at Jane Alcott sideways as she moved past, and there was some whispering. Miss Alcott went past her desk and into Lane's office. He was in his usual position, his chair swiveled around facing the window. Without looking at her, he held up his hand and wiggled his fingers. "Close the door," he said. She did so after taking a step into the room. Still, he didn't turn. "If it makes it go down any easier, Jane, I feel a whole lot worse about this than you do." She felt a catch in her throat. "I seriously doubt that," she said. Lane very slowly turned around in the chair. "Look," he said, "you've got no choice." There was no self-pity in the voice, just a kind of resigned awareness. You tie yourself to a rocket or to a groundhog. There's so much handwriting on the walls around here. The whole goddamn place looks like a gigantic men's room. I don't want to work for Doane. It's as simple as that." Lane studied her. "So give it a shot. If there's anybody on this earth who can put him down and keep him in line, it's you." She waited for a moment, hoping there would be something else said. When he remained silent, she knew that this was it. "Is that it?" she asked. Lane smiled at her. "Oh, there's a great deal more to say. A couple of items having to do with how grateful I am for all you've done for me. But unfortunately, I'm stone-cold sober now and not given to loquaciousness." Then his smile faded, and his voice sounded intense. "But you know that, don't you, Jane? You know how grateful I am to you." They looked at one another, and they both smiled. The kind of smile friends exchange when one is on the train leaving and the other stands on the platform, waving goodbye. Jane Alcott turned and left the office, wondering why the decent guys, the nice guys, the sensitive, gentle, caring guys were either married or inaccessible. When she got to her desk, she started to clear away the drawers. One thing was certain. She'd never work for Harvey Doane. From the opposite end of the corridor, she was vaguely conscious of the secretaries breaking up with parting congratulations to the bride-to-be, Miss Trevor. One of the girls was humming, "For He's a Jolly Good Fellow," and as she passed Jane Alcott's desk, her voice carried through to the interior of Lane's office. He was sitting at his desk and looked up, listening to the passing melody. It reminded him of the previous night, and he sat there, pondering. He was not an imaginative man, at least not one given to fantasies around the clock. And it was very odd, he thought, those hallucinations. And it was odder yet that he had felt no fear at all. He supposed that it was because they were hallucinations, not phantoms. Hallucinations made up of wishful thinking and probably his gin and vermouth ration. He smiled a little wanly, listening to the tune as it floated by, and when he turned around to face his desk, the hallucinations had returned. It was the old war-surplus roller top that Pritikin had given him the first week he'd worked there. And the room was bare, and much smaller, and the sound of singing was louder now and came from many voices from outside. Like a captivated kid moving after the Pied Piper, he rose, crossed the room, and opened the door. What he saw was Pritikin's plastic products of 25 years ago. There were just two desks outside, and two secretaries, both older women in long skirts. One doubled as a switchboard operator. He remembered her, Harris, or Harrison, or something like that. He blinked at her, then turned to see Mr. Pritikin come out of his office. Pritikin's hair was black, and he wore a mustache. He walked directly over to Lane, smiled, patted him on the arm. "Well, sir, what's the first day been like, Randy?" Pritikin asked him. Lane stared at him, and then looked over his shoulder at a calendar on the wall. It read May, 1945. Still no fear, but now confusion. "The first day?" he asked. Pritikin chuckled. "Just wanted you to know I'm going to keep my eye on you, Randy. You're going to become our #1 salesman, numero uno. Plastics are going to make it, my boy. Plastics are going to kill them. And we're right there on the ground floor." Lane became conscious of a phone ringing, and one of the women looked up at him after answering it. "Mr. Lane," she said, "phone call for you. It's your wife. Want to get it on your own phone?" "My wife?" Lane whispered. "My wife?" "Yes, sir," the secretary said, smiling. "My wife?" Lane said, much louder as he ran back to his own office. He grabbed the phone as if wanting to devour it. Honey, it's Randy," he said, his heart pounding. His wife, Katie. Katie on the other end of the line. Katie back and part of his life. Katie. There was no sound on the other end, and when Lane looked up, the fantasy, or whatever it was, had ended. Miss Alcott stood at the open door. "Did you call me, Mr. Lane?" "Called you?" Lane said in a hollow, empty voice. "I thought I heard you call me." Lane shook his head, looked briefly at the phone in his hand, then put it back on its cradle. "Is there anything wrong?" Miss Alcott asked him. Lane looked at the framed picture of his wife. He touched it tenderly. "No," he said. "No, there's nothing wrong." And as he said it, he knew there was something very wrong, something infinitely wrong, something uncorrectable. He was like a man falling down a hillside, scrabbling for a rock or an outgrowth or something to grab onto and stop his fall. And it was too late. Much too late. Katie, he thought. Katie. Why in God's name, after 20 years, why can't I stop mourning? That night, Randy Lane went back to Tim Riley's bar. Very methodically, he pulled off the wooden slats that had been replaced across the front door and moved into its interior. He carried with him a beer glass, cadged from one of the 4 bars he'd visited that night. And he stood in the middle of the room, singing, "For he's a jolly good fellow," and waiting for it to happen again. A car pulled up outside. 2 policemen got out and carried flashlights into the bar. They played them on Randy Lane, who blinked and smiled, then bowed. "Good evening, gentlemen," he said happily. The cops looked at one another. "You better be the night watchman, buddy, or the equivalent," the first cop said to him. Lane laughed. "Night watchman? Hell, I outrank all night watchmen in the world. I am late a sergeant, 1st Platoon A Company, 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division. That's what I am. And I've just recently returned, VE Day now being behind us." The 2 cops looked at one another and grinned. Nothing insurmountable here, just a happy drunk. The first cop moved over to Lane and took him by the arm. "Why don't you come with us?" the cop said, "and we'll celebrate the event. It isn't every day a war ends." Lane smiled, but stood his ground. "I'd like to accommodate you, officer, I really would. But the festivities take place here. Very shortly, Tim Riley will accompany my old man on the piano, while my old man sings 'It's a Long Way to Tipperary.' They will do it in unharmonious harmony, but what they lack in symmetry, they make up with gusto." The cop increased the pressure on Lane's arm, and his voice took on a brittle, don't give me any crap quality. "You better come with us, buddy." At this point, McDonough walked into the bar. The second cop shone his flashlight on him, then lowered it when he saw the uniform. "I'll take care of him," McDonough said. "I know him. You know him well enough to explain to him that he can get 30 days apiece for trespassing and being under the influence, plus tack on 90 more for breaking and entering?" the first cop asked. "I said I'd take care of him," McDonough said. The 2 cops looked at one another, then moved out of the bar. McDonough walked over to Lynn, who chuckled and did a little jig, then winked at McDonough and threw his arm around him. "McDonough, my lad, you're just in time." McDonough gently removed Lane's arm. "I'm just in time to ride you home, Randy. I'm just going off duty, and I got my car parked less than a block away." Lane frowned. "Not going to stay for the party?" He made a gesture encompassing the dark, empty room. McDonough's voice was very gentle. "The party's over, Randy." Lane stared at him. "Over?" He looked around the room again. "Where's everybody gone, huh? Where's everybody gone?" McDonough exhaled. "To their respective rewards," he said. The party's been over for 25 years, Randy. He took his arm. Come on, let's go home. Lane looked down at McDonough's hand, then carefully removed it. Officer McDonough, he said, this is where it is. Right here. This is where what is? McDonough asked. Lane walked over to the long bar. The best years of my life, he said over his shoulder. He put his glass down on the bar. You may want to phone downtown for a psycho squad or put out a call for reinforcements, but something's happening to me. He turned and peered through the darkness at McDonough. I keep getting beckoned to by ghosts, Mr. McDonough. Every now and then it's 1945. He grinned. How do you like them apples? Then he held up his hand, shutting off McDonough's response. And if you think that sounds nuts, try this one. I wish to God those ghosts would stick around. They're the best friends I've got. I feel a whole hell of a lot more comfortable with them than I do with all those warm, living, flesh and blood bodies I ride up and down the elevators with. Randy, McDonough said, why don't you tell me about it? In the car. Lane cut him off. I'll tell you about it right here. He took a step away from the bar. I rate something better than I've got. Honest to God, I do. Where does it say that every morning of a man's life he's got to Indian wrestle with every young contender off the sidewalk who's got an itch to climb up a rung? He moved over to McDonough and cupped his hands around the policeman's face. Hey, McDonough? McDonough, he whispered. I've put in my time. Understand? I've paid my dues. I shouldn't have to get hustled to death in the daytime and die of loneliness every night. That's not the dream. That's not what it's all about. His voice broke, and his hands fell to his sides, and as he turned away, McDonough noticed that his cheeks were wet. Come on, Randy, he said. I'll drive you home. Lane nodded. 67 Bennett Avenue. McDonough shook his head. That's not where you live. The hell it isn't. That's where you lived. Now you live in that high-rise on Norton. Lane turned to him. The hell I do. I don't live there. I just wash my socks there. I just eat my TV dinners there. That's where I watch Clark Gable and Myrna Loy at midnight. And if I phone Bigelow's 666-432, I can get waterless cookery, my carpets cleaned, or a digital computerized date whose personality is identical to my own. My God, he said softly. I live at 67 Bennett Avenue. 2-story, white frame. Katie and I bought it 6 months after we were married. McDonough studied him, and his voice carried with it an infinite gentleness. It's empty now, Randy. They're tearing down all the houses on the block. Going to be an apartment complex. Lane moved towards the door. So humor me, McDonough? Drive me there anyway? McDonough nodded and followed him out onto the sidewalk. Bennett Avenue was dark, the houses empty and boarded up. A big sign on the edge of the block announced that a construction company was going to turn it into some kind of a garden, a mecca for senior citizens. McDonough parked his car in front of a faded white 2-story house with a sagging porch and a yard covered with crabgrass flanked by a broken picket fence. Lane put down the window and looked out at the 67 still visible over the front door. "Well?" McDonough asked, a little impatiently. Lane grinned. "Don't build 'em like they used to." He opened up the car door and got out. "I'll walk from here." McDonough looked nonplussed. "Walk? Look, Randy, I can—" Lane turned to him. "I can walk from here, McDonough. I'm sober now." McDonough studied him for another moment. "Okay, but don't go knocking any doors down. You get a collar on you the next time, I won't be around to help." He put the car in low gear. "Good night, Randy. Get some sleep." Lane nodded, shut the car door, and threw him a salute. The police car pulled away from the curb, down the street, and disappeared around a corner. Lane stood there for a moment, then turned and looked at the house. His eyes moved from window to window, and he heard the sound of voices, Katie's voice, his own, and laughter, and hellos, and goodbyes, and all the jumbled language of the past, so sweet, so unbearably sweet. He took a step over to the broken front gate, and Katie's voice hung over the still night air. "Supper's ready, Randy. Randy, will you wipe your shoes off? You're tracking mud all over the hall carpet. Good night, Randy, darling. Randy, my love. Randy? Randy? Randy." Miss Alcott was standing by her car, staring across at him. He turned very slowly to face her. The voices, the ghosts fled. "You lost?" he asked her. "I thought you might be," she said nervously. He shook his head. "Hell no. This is where I live." Then he grinned. "Correction. This is where I used to live." She took a deep breath. "I know it's presumptuous, but when you didn't come back from lunch, I got concerned. I remembered you mentioning Tim Riley's bar. By the time I got there, the policeman was just putting you in his car. I followed." Lane was amused and touched. "You followed, huh? Because you were concerned? And Mr. Pritikin, that Sidney Greenstreet of the plastics business, was he concerned too?" There was a silence. "Go ahead, Miss Alcott, tell me." "He was upset." "Upset?" He nodded. "I've no doubt, and I'm sure our Mr. Doane put his oar in." With unholy glee, she said. "And I'm sure he called Mr. Pritikin's attention to the fact that as of 11 a.m. I had left the premises." Miss Alcott didn't answer him for a moment. Then she nodded. Lane moved away from the picket fence over to her. "I'm on my way out, Janie. You are aware of that, aren't you?" Again she nodded. Lane shrugged, then looked back toward the house. "Katie and I bought this 6 months after we were married. Katie was my wife." Miss Alcott surveyed the faded ruin. "It must have been quite lovely." "It sure as hell was. It was white with blue shutters, and it had a blue tile roof, and it had a big fireplace in the living room, and it had 2 extra bedrooms upstairs that we were going to use for the kids." He said it all matter-of-factly. "We had a lot of plans for it." He moved back over to the broken fence and looked across the crabgrass toward the porch. "She died not too long afterward. And there went the plans and everything else. Blue shutters," he added disjointedly. "Blue shutters and a blue tile roof." "You must have loved her very much," Miss Alcott said softly. Lane smiled. to the depth and breadth and height my soul can reach." He stopped and turned to her, which is from Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who is passé and is no longer quoted except by lachrymose aging men. "Have you had anything to eat?" Miss Alcott asked him. Lane nodded. "I have had sufficient to drink, which more than compensate for what I haven't had to eat. But I thank you," he said, smiling. "I thank you for caring. It's very much like you." Jane Alcott had shoved down the impulse to reach out and touch this man's face, to fondle him, to hold him to her. "Randy," she said, this time conjuring up the first name with some difficulty, "do you think I've played den mother because I feel sorry for you?" She shook her head. "That's not what it's all about." He studied her. "Did I ask you what it's all about?" "I don't just care about you, Randy. I care for you. Not that it makes a damn, but I happen to be in—" He had moved over to her and gently covered her mouth. "Enough," he said. "Enough already." Then he let his fingers run gently across her cheek. "I am, obviously, past prime," he said, "but I'm not built out of pig iron, so please don't make it tough for me, huh?" There was the sudden rolling sound of distant thunder, and then sporadic lightning. Miss Alcott pointed to her car. "You'll need a ride," she said. "It's going to rain." Lane looked up at the dark sky and felt the first drops of rain. He started to follow her over to the car, then stopped as she got in and looked back toward the house. "What's the matter?" "It was raining that night, too." "What night?" He was remembering. The memory of it came out in words, but spoken to no one in particular. "She'd had a miserable cold, couldn't shake it, wouldn't go to a doctor. And when I got home, there was a neighbor from next door. They'd tried to call me, but I wasn't in." He looked through the car window at Jane sitting there. "Is that a kick?" he asked. "I'm peddling plastics, and my wife is dying." She leaned across the front seat and opened up the window. "Mr. Lane, Randy, listen to me." The rain cascaded down on top of him. "That's the story of my life," he said. "I swear to God, a little too late for everything." "Please get in," she begged him. Lane turned and started toward the house. "Katie," he called. "Katie, I'm coming. Katie, stay there. I'm coming, Katie." He stumbled near the front gate, then picked himself up, walked toward the sagging front porch and up the stairs. He reached for the doorknob, and the door gave instantly. He was in a hospital corridor, the rain dripping from him. He heard muffled bells and announcements on a loudspeaker, and murmuring voices, and then a doctor came over to him. The doctor fiddled nervously with the stethoscope around his neck. His voice was grimly professional, struggling to conjure up a personal sympathy to cover a most impersonal death. "You're Mr. Lane." Lane nodded. "I came as fast as I could. One of my neighbors told me that—" He stopped abruptly, seeing the look on the doctor's face. "I'm afraid you're too late, Mr. Lane. It was pneumonia. We did everything we could, but—" Lane didn't hear anything else. "You're too late, Mr. Lane." The words flooded his brain, echoing and re-echoing, smashing against the walls of his consciousness. Too late. Much too late. And always too late. He was late that bloody dawn in Normandy, when the funked-out kid got caught in the hedgerows, and he'd lost a race with a German Tiger tank, having to throw himself into a ditch at the last moment, while the tank turned the kid into a screaming mincemeat pancake. He was too late telling his father that it was time to slow down, that at age 55 plus, a man had to slow down to a walk. And then his father was dead of a heart attack, and he was too late in his own realization of time passing. Much as Tim Riley had failed to note that dingy little bars with sawdust floors were becoming extinct, along with the nickel beer and the free sandwich. And it followed that he was too late in his own awareness that the soft sell, the friendly passing of the time of day, and the honoring of the word of mouth was an ancient salesmanship long since passé. And with Katie, God, how late he'd been. How belated had been his awareness of her frailty, her littleness, and the thin line that separated humans from extinction. Late. Always late. So goddamned late. Then he closed his eyes and covered his ears against the noise inside his head, because he couldn't take any more. He simply couldn't take any more. It was an anxious, tight-lipped Jane Alcott who, on the following day, tried for the 5th time to reach Randy Lane's apartment, only to hear a filtered voice answer, "I'm sorry, Mr. Lane's apartment isn't answering." "Thank you," she said, putting the phone down. Then she looked up and saw Harvey Doane standing there by her desk. "I could have saved you the trouble," he said. "Your boss spent the night in the city jail. Little squib in the morning paper." Behind him, Pritikin appeared, carrying his briefcase. He stopped, looked first at Miss Alcott and Doane, then at the closed door of Lane's office. Doane turned to him, smiling. "Oh, Mr. Pritikin, I'm afraid we're minus a sales director this morning." If she could hit him with something, Miss Alcott thought, something heavy on that pompadoured Edwardian hair, or strangle him with that broad 6-inch striped tie. "Lane sick?" Pritikin asked, and it was an accusation. "I would imagine so," Doane chuckled, "after spending the night in the drunk tank." There was an ice-cold silence. "Should you hear from Mr. Lane," Pritikin said to Jane, "tell him I'd very much like to see him at his earliest convenience." Then he continued on into his office. "Just a small suggestion, Miss Alcott," Doane said to her. "Always play the favorites." She looked deep into the boyish face and the Vaseline smile. "That applies to thoroughbred horses, Mr. Doane. You happen to be a jackal." She wasn't aware of how loud her voice was until she noted the line of secretaries staring at her. Doane felt almost nauseous with humiliation. He sensed the eyes of the women on him. Then he cleared his throat. "As of the moment, Miss Alcott, you are unemployed." But he was conscious that this was a skimpy face-saving item that saved nothing. This bosomy broad had laid him out, and precious damn little could be salvaged. He retreated back into his office, but too late to escape the last salvo. Miss Alcott had risen and was regarding him steadily. "At last," she said, "I have something to thank you for, because not to have to work for you, Mr. Doane, is my most cherished ambition." The double doors at the far end of the corridor opened, and Randy Lane appeared. Miss Alcott's eyes widened. Doane turned to look in that direction. Lane looked bearded, disheveled, a little lost as he walked very slowly past the secretaries at their desks, each of whom gave him a little side look, and then stared, fascinated, at the tableau of Doane and Alcott. It was a collective holding of breaths, waiting for the confrontation. Lane walked past both of them directly into his office and closed the door. "Are you going to tell him?" Doane asked tersely. "Or shall I?" Miss Alcott stepped out from behind her desk. "You put your hand on that doorknob," she said softly, "and I'll break it off at the wrist." She waited just long enough to see his face burn red. Then she went into Lane's office. He was standing behind his desk, as if waiting for her. "Jesus," he said, "I'm a dull, goddamned man, and I'd count it a favor, Janie, honest to God I would, if you didn't look at me sympathetically." "Okay," she said. "No sympathy. How about a cup of black coffee instead?" He shook his head. "Add this to my long list of accomplishments. I now have a record of arrest." "I know," she said. He squinted, scratched at his beard stubble, and looked a little confused. "You know," he said, "a great deal can happen to a man in 24 hours. Then the phone rang. Lane looked at it briefly, then ignored it. Jane Alcott finally moved over and picked it up. "Mr. Lane's office?" she said. She looked worried, covered the mouthpiece. "It's Mr. Pritikin?" He took the receiver from her and sat down in his chair. "Randolph Lane here." "Yes, sir, I quite understand." "Oh, yes, indeed, I know all about corporate images." "That too, Mr. Pritikin. I know the value of good public relations." "Oh, yes, indeed, sir. I'm close to an expert on that." "I quite understand. I'll have vacated my desk by—" He stopped, looked at his wristwatch. "Would 10 minutes be okay?" "Fine, and thank you for telling me." He put the receiver down, pointed at her. "No sympathy. You promised." "No sympathy," she repeated, the sharp, yearning hunger for him twisting at her insides. He stood up, opened up a couple of desk drawers, fumbled around, and picked up nothing except the bottle of half-consumed whiskey. He cradled this under his arm, like a football, and then picked up his wife's picture. "I don't think there's anything else around here," he said, looking around the room, "that belongs to me or that I want to take with me. When you do your house cleaning for Mr. Doane, if you should run across anything, just—" She cut in. "I won't be working for Mr. Doane or anyone else around here. Wherever you go, that's where I go." He looked at her a little enigmatically. "That's biblical," he said, "and is very sweet." He shook his head. "But I'm afraid that won't be possible. Where I'm going, Jane, I don't think they'd let you in." He laughed a little as he came out from behind his desk and moved toward the door. He turned to her. "Goodbye, Janie dear. I've been late, too late all my life. Now I'm going to go back and stake a claim to some of the better moments. And this trip. I'll be a son of a bitch if I'll be late for this one." He left the office and moved down the row of secretaries' desks, conscious of their staring at him, but not giving a damn about them or anything else. When he passed the switchboard operator, she called out to him, "There's a call for you, Mr. Lane." Lane leaned over the little partition separating the switchboard area, picked up a phone. "Mr. Lane no longer works here," he said, "and Mr. Lane no longer lives here, and Mr. Lane is no longer available. And if you're interested in plastics, I recommend a Mr. Harvey Doane. He is of the new breed, and should you not know it, the new breed is built out of plastics." He put the phone down and moved out of the office, announcing over his shoulder to the gaping switchboard operator, "If anyone should ask, I've gone to a homecoming at Tim Riley's bar. My homecoming." Mr. Pritikin sat at his desk and was surprised and not very pleased when Miss Alcott entered his office unannounced. She stood a few feet from his desk, and he noticed that she looked very pale. "Orders," he began to say, and then shut up. "For Mr. Randolph Lane," Jane Alcott said, "who has just departed the premises. One small lonely word on his behalf, since nobody else seems to give a damn. In exchange for 25 pretty good years, you've given him the boot and the back of your hand. Now he's alone and tired and a little frightened. Maybe the least you could have given him, Mr. Pritikin, would have been a gold watch. That wouldn't have been bad, but just a word, a gentle word would have been better. Just a reminder to him that he's not obsolete. He's not unloved. He's not a relic to be carted off to the dump. Now he's chasing ghosts, when all he really needed was that one word to tell him that he had worth. That much you could have given him. She stood there silently for a moment, her head down. Then she looked up. That much, Mr. Pritikin, she said very gently, you should have given him. Before he could answer, she had turned and left the office. When Randy Lane finally reached Tim Riley's bar much later that night, 2 hard-hatted construction workers were just taking the front door off its hinges and carrying it out to a truck parked out front. 2 other men inside were removing the last of the electrical fixtures. The truck's lights had been left on to give illumination to the scene. Lane stepped through the opening to the bar and almost ran into one of the hard hats as he walked past Lane carrying 2 rolls of wire. "What's going on?" Lane asked. The workman answered without stopping, "We're knocking the place down." "Tonight?" Lane called to him through the opening. "Overtime," the workman said from the sidewalk as he headed toward the truck. "We're behind schedule. You want to get out of the way, mister?" Other workmen went in and out past Lane. There was the sound of a pneumatic drill from another section of the ground floor, and outside, another work crew went industriously at the job of knocking down the walls. One of them had gone behind the bar and was starting to hammer at the big mirror that hung behind it. "Oh, wait a minute," Lane called to him, running towards the bar. "Wait a minute." He vaulted the bar, seized the man, and whirled him around. He was looking into the face of Tim Riley, and suddenly the lights were on. There was a red, white, and blue bunting stretched across the bar. "Welcome home, Randy." The booths were filled. The jukebox was playing in competition with the piano. People walked back and forth with beer mugs in their hands, laughing and singing. And then he saw his father at the piano and walked over to him. His father, with the barbed wire white hair that stuck straight up, and the perpetual grin and the kindly wrinkled blue eyes. His father winked at him. "How are you, Randy?" "Fine, Pop," Lane answered. "Just fine." Then he turned and saw Katie. He held out his hands to her, and she approached him. He took her to him, holding her very closely and very tightly, kissing her hair. "Hello, darling," she said to him. "Katie," Lane answered hoarsely. "Katie, God, how I've missed you." Tim Riley came out from behind the bar and walked over to Lane, slapping him on the back. "Good to see you, Tim," Lane said. "Awful good to see you." "And you, Randy. Good to see you. What's more, is on the house." He beckoned to an apron waiter who drew a beer and slid it expertly down the bar. Tim caught it deftly and handed it over to Lane. Then Lane's father began to play "It's a Long Way to Tipperary" on the piano, and the crowd began to move in around them. Lane looked at the faces. He knew them. Pete Denovich, dead of a heart attack in '54, played ball with him on the school football team. And there was his wife. They called her Brownie, a tiny woman, barely 5 feet tall. And there was McDonough, his stiff policeman's tunic opened up with an undershirt showing through. He knew them all, their names, where they lived, what they meant to him. He put his arm around Katie and kept looking at her profile, holding tight to her, touching her, caressing her, and every now and then leaning down to kiss her. Then all the people faced Lane and held up their beer mugs. After a moment their voices died away, and all was silent. It was then that Katie, very softly, began to sing Auld Lang Syne, and then a chorus of soft voices joined her. Lane turned her to him, staring into her face, which somehow seemed shadowed, the features hazy. "Katie," Lane said, "no sad songs for this occasion. This is a homecoming." From some place far off he heard a wall crumble and a glass break, then the sound of the pneumatic drill. "Go ahead, Katie," Lane said louder. "Sing." He looked around the group. "All of you, sing. This is an occasion. I mean, it's not every day a guy comes back." His voice was louder and more supplicating. "Please, everybody, sing." His father stopped playing the piano and turned to look at him. "Randy," he said softly. "Go ahead, Pop. Give us a couple of choruses of Tipperary. Go ahead, Tim. Play the piano for him." He whirled around to face the crowd. Everybody sing." Glass was being shattered, and plaster cracked and wood splintered, and then all noise stopped for the second time. Again, it was absolutely still. "How about that, Randy?" his father said to him. "They're tearing down Tim Riley's bar." He looked over to Tim. "That's what they're doing, Tim." Riley nodded. "Don't pay any attention," Lane shouted. "Forget about them. Come on, everybody. This is where it is, right here, this place, this bar." They just stared at him. He grabbed Katie. "I'm back, Katie. Understand? It's 1945, and I'm back. We're going to get married, you and me. Then we're going to buy a white two-story house. That's what's going to happen. Let me tell you something. Let me tell you this right now. We're going to change everything. We're going to do it right this time. I'm not going to lose you, Katie." He clutched at her, as if by this embrace he could put off death and everything else. "I'm not going to lose you, Katie. I swear to God, I'm not going to lose you." The lights began to fade, and the figures became even more indistinct. Lane moved away from Katie and reached for one person after the other and felt nothing. He went from face to face, figure to figure, then back to his father, reaching for him. "Pop," he said, "please, Pop." There was just stillness. "Wait a minute, all of you," he said to the figures as they disappeared in front of him. "I can't stay here. I don't have any place. I'm an antique, a has-been. I don't have any function here. I don't have any purpose." He held out his hands in front of him, fists clenched. "You leave me now, and I'm marooned." He pointed toward the window. "I can't survive out there. Pop, Tim, they stack the deck that way. They fix it so you get elbowed off the earth. You just don't understand what's going on now. The whole bloody world is coming apart at the seams, and I can't hack it." He began to sob. "I swear to God, I can't hack it." He turned, and there was Katie alongside. "Katie," he said brokenly, "you're all I've got. I can't lose you. I've lost everything else." And then he was alone, save for a workman who had re-entered the room. He looked out toward what was once a wall and saw the parking lot alongside. "Jesus, buddy," the workman said. "You want to get yourself killed? Get the hell out of here. The whole place is going to collapse in a minute. Now, come on," he ordered, pulling Lane's arm. Lane found himself out on the sidewalk. The workman had put up a cordon of rope, and there were several sidewalk superintendents who had gathered to see the final destruction. The last 3 walls cave in. But Randy Lane didn't wait. He walked away from the place, willing to himself that he wouldn't hear the noise. He wouldn't hear the walls come down. He wanted nothing but silence for the rest of the night. But as he approached the corner, he heard something else. There were voices singing, "For he's a jolly good fellow." He stopped abruptly and looked across the street. There was the cocktail lounge, all lit up, and there were faces at the window. He recognized Pritikin, and he also saw Jane Alcott as she moved away from the window and came out the door to walk over to him. She held out her hand, and he took it and followed her. She led him inside the cocktail lounge. It was crowded with people. He noticed Officer McDonough and a few other of the older men he'd worked with over the years. Then Pritikin detached himself from a group and approached him. "Randy Lane," he said in a voice Lane had never heard before. "It occurred to some of us, your friends, that a man shouldn't have 25 years go by without being remembered and thanked and reminded that he is held in deep affection and sizable esteem." Outside there was the distant noise of a wall collapsing. "It's to my discredit, Randy, and I ask you to forgive me for not having told you this before, and more than once." He raised his glass. "To the past 25 years, Mr. Lane, but much more important, to the next 25. Jane Alcott kissed him on the side of his face. Another man shook his hand. Even Harvey Doane, looking mortally wounded, tossed him a salute from a bar stool. Outside, another wall collapsed. Then somebody handed Lane a glass, and Miss Alcott hugged him, and they began to sing, "For he's a jolly good fellow." Outside, there was no more Tim Riley's bar. Dust was just settling over the broken walls, the mounds of brick, the slabs of glass. Only the bar remained, gouged and bent. But from this record came the soft sound of Auld Lang Syne sung by other voices. A workman threw a battered sign into the back of the truck, then shut the tailgate. The sign read Tim Riley's Bar. It rested atop a pile of 2x4s and a couple of legless chairs, but it was the only thing that could be seen over the sides of the truck, like the forlorn banner of a defeated army. The truck pulled away and carried Tim Riley's bar with it. And Randy Lane sipped at his beer and looked at the truck as it went by. Then he looked down into the scrubbed, shining face of Jane Alcott and noted the freshness, the loveliness, and the giving in the eyes. Not like Katie, blonde rather than dark, eyes set farther apart, face just a bit older as he remembered her. But a good face, a lovely face. And he felt something stirring, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He smiled at her and put his glass down, then looked at the singing people surrounding him, the ones he'd have to live with and die with for the rest of his time. There was no one else. At long last, he realized that. You've been listening to They're Tearing Down Tim Riley's Bar, written by Rod Serling. Thanks for listening.